Today we're talking shooting manual. Learning how to shoot manual is one of the most popular topics for beginners. Today I'm going to distill down everything that you need to know in an easy to understand process. Really, the goal that I have for this video is to help you understand how to think and problem solve as a photographer, so that you're not simply copying settings, but you're able to take these concepts and apply them to any shot, any location on your own. The first thing that we need to do is to put in place a strategy to understand what our goals are when we're shooting photos, so that all of our tactics in terms of the camera settings are made in order to meet those goals. The first being focus. We want our shots to be in focus and sharp, not blurry. Obviously, there's cases where stylistically you want your photos to be blurry, but in general, you want your subject or your subjects plural to be in focus. The second is exposure. When we take a photo, it should be properly exposed, meaning not overexposed or too light, or not underexposed or too dark. When I take a photo, I'm always thinking about these two goals and in this order. First, set focus, and then exposure. Let's talk about how you can achieve these two goals shooting in manual using three settings on your camera: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. It doesn't matter what camera you're shooting with or what lens you're using. If it's a mirrorless or DSLR camera, if it's a crop sensor camera or a full frame camera, these three camera settings you can change on every camera, and they make up what is called the exposure triangle. I'm going to explain each of these three camera settings with some examples, and then we're going to go out in the real world and apply these concepts to a live shoot so that you can see them in action. Let's start with aperture, because this is always the setting that I lock in first. The aperture is simply the opening in the lens that allows light to pass through and hit your camera's sensor. It can be opened or closed to adjust how much light your lens lets in, and it's represented with what's called an f-stop. I like to think of the f-stop as the focus number. The higher the number, the more of your image is in focus. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, here's a few images. The first image with a small f-stop of f1.4, only a small amount of the image is in focus. The rest of the image is out of focus. This is referred to as a shallow depth of field, and it's typically what you want when you're shooting things like portraits, where you want the subject to be the main draw of the image. Take a look at another image where the f-stop is a lot higher, and you can see that the entire image is in focus. Not ideal for portraits, but for a landscape shot where you want your entire frame to be in focus, a higher f-stop number is what I would typically use. As a reference, I typically shoot my landscapes somewhere around f9 to f11, sometimes f16. Anything higher than this, like f22, and your image tends to look a little softer, meaning not as sharp. For portraits, I like to shoot them anywhere from as shallow as f1.4 up to even as high as f4 sometimes. Lenses that are able to achieve really low f-stops like f1.4 are typically a lot more expensive. If you're shooting multiple subjects in one shot, like a group photo or a family photo for example, then your aperture needs to be kind of somewhere in between your portrait setting and your landscape setting. So you may be shooting somewhere around f5.6 all the way up to maybe even f8. It's going to depend on where the subjects are placed in the frame, and you're going to need to take a test shot and then make sure that everyone's in focus and then adjust as necessary. If you've been following along on your camera and you have it in manual mode, as you adjust your aperture setting, your image is going to get lighter or darker. This is because as you increase the f-stop number to get more of your image in focus, the opening in your lens gets smaller and lets in less light, and vice versa. You have to give something to get something, and in the case of the f-stop, it's light for focus. More in focus, less light. Less in focus, more light. Let's go back and take a look at our goals. Focus and exposure, and always in that order. Set focus first, then exposure. So find the f-stop number that gets everything that you want in focus, and then move on to the next setting. Don't worry if your image is not properly exposed yet, we'll get to that. Focus first. Next up, we have shutter speed. When you press the shutter button on your camera, depending on the type of camera that you have, either a mirror or your camera's shutter curtain will flip up and expose your camera sensor to the light, which captures the image. The amount of time that your camera sensor is exposed to that light is referred to as the shutter speed, and is represented as a fraction of a second. The higher the number on the bottom of the fraction, the faster the shutter speed. If you think about how this works and then go to the extreme on either ends, you can kind of understand what's going on. Let's say you set your shutter speed super slow, like 10 seconds. That means that when you press the shutter button to take a photo, the mirror or the shutter curtain flips up and it exposes your camera sensor to light for 10 seconds. Now, any movement that happens in the frame in that 10 seconds, including any movement from the camera moving by just holding it with your hand, is gonna get captured by your camera's sensor. This motion that your camera captures during this time is referred to as motion blur. Well, that's not good. If you're shooting a portrait, for example, you don't want any motion blur at all. However, if you're doing something like long exposure photography or light painting, then this motion blur is exactly what you want. What about the other extreme end of the shutter speed spectrum? If you use a super high shutter speed, it means that your camera sensor is only exposed to light for a very small fraction of a second. If your shutter speed is fast enough, it essentially freezes all motion. So a really high shutter speed freezes all motion, and a really slow shutter speed captures all motion. Okay, well then why not just use the fastest shutter speed all the time and then you'll never have any motion in your images? Well, again, you have to give something to get something. When your shutter speed is so fast that it freezes all motion, it means that your camera sensor is only exposed to light for a very small amount of time, which means that you don't get a lot of light in your image. So to freeze motion, you have to give up exposure. Let's go back to our goals again. Focus and exposure. If your shutter speed is too slow, your image will have motion blur and your subjects won't be in focus. If your shutter speed is too fast, your image is going to be underexposed because you won't get enough light into your sensor. So what do? When it comes to shutter speed, we choose the slowest possible shutter speed that'll freeze all the motion in our shot, and then we move on. There's no sense in using a super high shutter speed like 1/4000 when a shutter speed of 1/400 would have frozen all the motion and resulted in a sharp image. Remember, you need to give up something to get something. So why would you give up more light if you're not getting anything else in return? For portraits, for example, I'll shoot somewhere in the 1/400 to 1/800 range. This ensures that any small facial movements or movements from the camera get frozen. For sports and wildlife photography, you're shooting way higher, like 1/2000, for example. For landscape or product photography, where your subjects aren't moving at all, then you can get away with shooting somewhere in the 1/100 or even lower than this if you're shooting on a tripod. I try to stay a little bit faster than I think that I'll need to on the shutter speed side, just to ensure that any motion gets frozen. A good rule of thumb for shooting handheld is to always set your shutter speed to twice your focal length. So if you're shooting with a 50mm lens, then you want to have your shutter speed set to at least 1/100. And that's just accounting for your hands moving. Obviously, if you're shooting things like sports or wildlife, then you're going to want to increase that. All right, let's look at our goals again. Focus and exposure. At this point, I think it's helpful to look at this chart that I made, which shows which of the 3 camera settings affect each goal. You can see that the 2 camera settings we've already gone over, aperture and shutter speed, affect both the focus and the exposure. ISO, on the other hand, only affects the exposure, which is why we set that in last. Remember, get your image in focus and then get it properly exposed. ISO is a pretty basic setting, and I like to think of it kind of like a dimmer switch. The higher the ISO, the brighter your image. The lower the ISO, the darker your image. It doesn't affect the focus of your image at all. But as with the other camera settings, you have to give something to get something. In the case of ISO, the higher that you raise it, the more artificial noise that you get in your images. These days, modern cameras are pretty amazing with this compared to older cameras, and you can get away with pretty high ISOs without seeing any impact at all to the image. However, there's obviously a point where when you go past it with your ISO, you are going to see some noise. You can fix this quite a bit in your editing software, but a good rule of thumb is to try and set your ISO as low as possible while still getting proper exposure and proper focus in your image. We've talked a lot about how to get proper focus in your images, but how do you get proper exposure? Well, there's 2 ways really. If you're using a mirrorless camera, then the best way, in my opinion, is to just judge it based on what you see on your camera's display. If you're not using a mirrorless camera, there's still kind of 2 ways that you can do this. The first is to just take a test shot and then see what your exposure looks like and then adjust from there. And another way is to use your camera's light meter. Every camera will have something that looks like this on their display. It may be a number like this or a bar with a -1, -2, 0, +1, and so on with a little indicator arrow. This is a light meter and it's telling us if the image is underexposed or overexposed, overexposed showing as a positive number and underexposed showing as a negative number. And if you're shooting in auto mode or one of the priority modes like aperture priority or shutter priority mode, this is exactly how your camera is going to expose your images. There are different ways to set up your light meter and how it reads. By default, it kind of just takes a reading of all the light in your frame and takes an average based on that. Sometimes that's fine, and if you expose based on this, you can get okay results. But one good example of where shooting with a light meter can kind of fall apart is if you're shooting in a really bright scene. If you're shooting in snow, for example, where your entire frame is white, then your camera is going to think that your image is way overexposed and your light meter is going to give you a way off reading of where you should actually expose your image to. This is honestly why I would say just shoot based on what you see on the display. If you're shooting with a DSLR, you can use the light meter as kind of a guide, take a test shot, and then adjust from there. So we've set our goals, we've gone through the 3 main camera settings that affects these goals. I think it's time that we go out and we test these concepts in the real world. All right, so we're out at a local park right now, and I just kind of want to illustrate how I would go about shooting manual and kind of my thought process behind setting up the camera. So I see a cool little shot here that I want to take with the kayak out there in the middle, a couple people on it. We have some foreground elements here with the shrubbery. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my aperture. I want this to be set pretty shallow, like f1.4, so that the focus is entirely on the canoe. Once I set that, I'm going to go ahead and increase my shutter speed until the shot is exposed properly, and I'm going to drop my ISO as low as possible. Right now my ISO is set to 100, and I'm just going to adjust the shutter speed now until the image looks exposed properly. And that works out to be about 1/1000. While we're here, I might as well take a city shot here. I'm going to raise my aperture up to about f8 just to make sure the whole cityscape is in focus. ISO I'm going to keep at 100, and I'm just going to adjust my shutter speed until it's exposed properly. I think that's pretty good. That's 1/80. Usually when you're shooting out in the day like this, or when there's sunlight out, your shutter is going to be way higher than it needs to be because you're using your shutter to adjust for the exposure. Like I really only need to be shooting at, double my focal length, which would be 1/80, but my image is probably overexposed here, so I need to crank it up more just to make it exposed properly. I'm just going to keep walking around, see if there's anything else I can take a shot of. Kind of keep illustrating these concepts. Hey guys, quick break from the real world applications to let you know that I put together kind of a cheat sheet of everything that we've talked about in this video. Totally free, linked in the description below. So if you want to print it, put it in your camera bag, fold it up, put it in your pocket, whatever, I don't care. Do with it what you want. All right, back to the real world. Take a shot of this little goose here. f1.4, 1/1000, ISO 100, still looks good. We get a cool little shot of these canoes with the sun gleaming off the one side. I want this kind of shallow, maybe f2, ISO 100, and then I'll keep increasing the shutter speed. This is another cool little spot that I like to take shots of the city at. And I actually like to shoot this at pretty shallow depths of field because the goal of this shot is to actually have some foreground element like this tree here, but have it be out of focus. So I'm going to shoot it at like f2. ISO 100 still. And then 1/8 over 640 seems to be where it looks good. You'll probably notice that I'm never raising my ISO above 100. And that's pretty common when you're shooting out in the day. When you're shooting in lower light situations, that's when you'll need to raise your ISO in order to keep your shutter speed high enough to freeze all the motion. But right now I'm kind of just using shutter speed to control exposure rather than motion. It'd be cool to get a person in this shot. Do this at f 1.4. 1 over 800 seems good. Maybe 1 over 1000. Always check to make sure that your subject is in focus before you leave without taking another shot. Another sort of the same cityscape, but just with a different foreground element in it. Again, this one will be at like, I don't know, f5. It's probably good enough. 1 over 60. See, here's a situation where 1 over 60 is a little too low. So I'll raise my ISO. 400 is fine. And then I can crank my shutter speed a bit higher. One over 250. Probably wondering, why was I shooting at f5 and not, f9 for a landscape type shot? That's because the landscape's so far away. Like when you have no foreground elements that you want in focus, then you can use a lower f-stop number and the whole landscape in the distance will still be in focus. If there were some more foreground elements that I wanted to get in focus, then yes, I would need to use a higher f-stop number like f9, f11. So it's just going to depend on the scene that you're shooting. All right, I think that's a wrap. Okay, I know this was a little bit of a long video. I tried to make it as short as possible while still giving you all the information that you need to know without any added fluff. If you found this helpful or you think there's something that I missed, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.